Everyone. Good evening or good night. This is Life with Trey and Jay, and I am Jay. I'm Janelle. Tracy is not with us today because unfortunately she had a loss in her family, and so she is with family and she's grieving, and she just took some time to be alone with Jesus, just to get her heart and mind right. But we are super excited to have Rasool on with us. We have always wanted Rasool to be on with us because he's a smart young man, like he's like you look super young and you always fool me with your 20 something year old daughter, but he's so intelligent and he loves the Lord, and he's what he calls a cultural translator. So he's a teaching pastor and a cultural translator. He does so much work in the community, and he's actually in seminary right now to get to be even better, being even better at what he does. And so we are super excited to talk about emotional healthy spirituality in Black men today. So actually we're starting off the month today, focusing on urban apologetics. And today we're going to talk about Black men being spiritually and emotionally healthy. So Rasool, let's get into this.
Yes, let's do it. Let's do it.
Let's do it. So first, before I even ask you any questions, can you tell me a little bit about why you decided to say yes to this? Because I know, you could have said no. There's other things that you could have been doing, but you said that this is the time to speak about this.
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, thank you so much for having me on. It is an honor. I kind of do my IG social media stalking of Life with Trey and Jay from afar. I do, because y'all bring so much life and just truth and beauty to what you do to Black women, holding it down for the faith in New York City. And we Epiphany is like our sister church, you know what I mean? At Bridge. And so, I'm so honored, really to be with you. I'm definitely, praying for Trey, and, just so you know that our hearts, Trey, we're thinking of you and praying with you. And I say yes, because actually the kind of, moment that she's in is a moment that many of us have experienced over the last year. I mean, we're up to about 560,000 COVID deaths just in the since March of 2020. And then on top of that, many of us, I just buried my grandmother on Tuesday, just a few days ago, and got to experience just firsthand the challenge and the trauma of what happens when we don't deal with our emotions. Because I saw, especially Black men, my cousins, my uncles, and others really struggle with what do I do with these things, these emotions, and how do I live out in a way that is a full human being when I am so much in a context where I'm told that that's not what it means to be a man, and that's not what it looks like. And so I just think this topic of emotionally healthy spirituality, specifically as it relates to Black men, is so important and is so timely. And that's where it was so fresh to me, because I just had the chance to see the good and the bad and the ugly of it right now. So I'm like, let's talk about it.
Wow. So I was going to ask you why it's important, but you've already explained that. What does it look like to be spiritually and emotionally healthy? And you might not know that exactly. I think you do, but try your best to answer that.
Yeah, well, first of all, the phrase, I want to give credit and honor to where honor is due. So there's a book by Pete Scazzaro called Emotionally Healthy Spirituality that came out just several years ago, and it just became a landmark work, a very important work, because the tagline is, it's impossible to be spiritually mature while remaining emotionally immature. That's a very provocative statement and thought, right? Like, on one end, when I read it, I remember thinking, that feels true, but can I say that it's impossible to be spiritually mature and while remaining emotionally immature? And then it started to remind me of all these stories that I hear in my church of people who, our church is predominantly single, about 75% single. And when people are trying to, it's cuffing season and folks are trying to find a boo, there's this confusion that oftentimes young women are having with, well, wait a minute, this guy is a leader at the church. He knows his Bible. He, worships, maybe be on a worship team, but he is toxic. Like toxic. How is that even possible? He's, you know what I mean? Like, in fact, in some ways, people feel like though I get worse options in the church than I do in the world because they are wolves in sheep's clothing. How do I even make sense of that? And I got to see this firsthand as, having a daughter in college and, and whatnot, and seeing these things and hearing these questions. And that was something that was a mystery to me, because I'm like, man, I want you to be with, a Christian man. But she's almost concluded, even with having a father in the house who's a pastor who she loves and respects, I don't know if Christian men are, and so I had to really wrestle and think about that just in my own home, let alone in my church context, where these type of frustrations emerge. And what we find is that when we talk about emotionally healthy spirituality, there's this there's a two aspects that need to be looked at the same time that oftentimes are in isolation. So if you try to just focus on spirituality, right, or faith and doctrine without dealing with the emotional inner world of people, then you wind up with legalistic, judgmental, self-righteous, unhealthy people like that. And here's the thing. People mistakenly think that that's a Christian problem. That's a unique thing. But first of all, in actuality, Jesus talked a lot about that problem because the people he was among were emotionally unhealthy in their spirituality, right? So that's a problem. But then on the other hand, you can get into the mode where people are so self-focused, so self-oriented. All they talk about is self-care, and what that becomes is an excuse to violate everyone else in order to put themselves first as men. Right. And so then you have this context where they have all the right language, they're using all the right trendy topics and terms, but there's no spirit of God there. There's no point of correction. And so what Scazzaro does with the emotionally healthy spirituality is he combines those things to say we need to learn and understand the insights that we have from the social sciences to understand what does it look like to be emotionally healthy, but then also shine those lights within the context of scripture so that we can also see, what the full picture is. And I think this is especially important in our communities because we have a lot of masks that people wear that protect themselves, but also prevent them from fully living out the fullness of who they're called to be. So, so there's some great insights I want to get into to share, to talk about, well, what is, how do we get to a point of emotional health, and what are the main reasons that we don't have emotional health? But I don't want to get ahead of myself. So you let me know when we can jump in.
So, well, there's a couple of things. Thank you for introducing the book, because eventually I was going to say, yes, this is from Pete Scazzaro. I always say his name wrong. But yes, from this book. And side note, while we were preparing for this, I said, wow, somebody needs to write a book for Black men with him. I think that would be you, but I don't know. I'm just saying, and we're not even done with the interview, but I just think, that'll be great, because he has it for women, but it's not, he doesn't have one specifically for men. And I do think there's something specific for Black men. But yeah, so why is it difficult for Black men to be emotionally and spiritually healthy?
All right.
I mean, you kind of touched on that, but yeah, let's get into it.
Let's do it. So there are several dynamics. I mean, my major was Africana Studies. My minor was in sociology. And so I've studied the Black experience as well as lived it. And when I think about it, you have to go back to, when we talk about African-American, the American context. Of course, our experience as people of African descent go back thousands of years to the continent, where there have been kingdoms, kings, queens, all that, on the west coast of Africa, the Songhai Empire, all of that. We know that, right? And on the east with the Horn of Africa, the Ethiopia, Egypt, all of that. So we know that there's a robust history that lives for years. At the same time, when we talk about the American context, that context really was birthed out of the transatlantic slave trade. And especially after the British banned the slave trade, and then that followed, then the Americans did it well, like in the early 1800s. People don't really think about this. Up until that point, you have this brutal system of dehumanizing people in the context of race that already existed. But then what actually takes even another turn is that once the slave trade, so the slave ships coming to the coast, bringing fresh people, ended, that began a process where slave holders began to be more intentional about breeding, within their people, and as the primary means through which to continue to populate. And that's even a dehumanizing way to think about breeding. Yeah, right. But that's what that it wasn't like trying to make family unions and whatnot. It was, and so the black love trauma of simultaneously, seeing your own wife or your mother or your daughter, raped, you know what I mean, in front of you, and not able to do anything about it. In fact, being used as a tool to psychologically manipulate you, as well as being made and forced to be a breeder, like an animal, like a horse, a stud, as it were. That these contexts, and then being separated from family, it's hard to imagine the type of trauma that would cause to men who thought that of themselves as providers and protectors, and you're not in the position to do any of those things. In addition to that, the messaging to justify this was Black men are dangerous. Black men are sexually like animalistic, and in many ways we've embraced those concepts, right? You talk about the length and all this stuff, and like people begin to embrace a lot of the system of Mandinga and all this stuff that comes along with that territory. But all of it is part of the dehumanization part. The reason why I bring that up is because even though there were still family units, that there's still a dissolution that happened. But even further, when we got to the Great Migration, when we got to the war on drugs in the 70s, now you're talking about mass incarceration. Let me just make it personal. Let me just make it personal. So my wife, her father, she was born in the South in North Carolina. But because of the racism where they were from, he could not get gainful employment and live out his, very confident way of being, because they saw that as a threat. So then he began to drive up to New York, to Philadelphia to work and establish things. But then 2 months turns into 6 months, turns into 8 months. So this creating this distance. So then having affairs take place, so then which causes a division in the marriage. So you can literally trace the fracture in the family to this racist posture that they had, because otherwise folks wouldn't have moved up. It wasn't like just a whole bunch of people just decided, hey, let's go move and retire to Florida. It was a refugee crisis that caused people to move. And this is something that poverty itself causes trauma. And in many different ways. And so that we're living out these trauma responses. I'll tell you about my own background. So my dad and my mom got together when she was, really young. She had my brother when she was 18, me when she was 20. But he was hustling on the street because he was trying to be industrious, and there was not options and opportunities for him. And he made some bad choices. And so now he's selling drugs, and that causes her to break up with him. And that, so now that's why I didn't grow up with him in the home. Then he's murdered when I'm 6 in the street. Wow. And so my own fatherlessness was an experience of those things. So you just multiply that over the context. And I'm just telling you about just my 2 people in my family, right? Like my wife and I, not to mention generations up, generations down. And so the emotionally unhealth has come in a context of this trauma that has existed through poverty, through racism, through these definite, and just the fall of humanity, that you add up to all of that, and it really causes a sense of brokenness. And so a lot of the mask wearing, a lot of the posturing comes from a place of trying to, by a defense mechanism, because the code on the streets is I got to be tough. I can't show weakness. I can't be like crying. They can't see that because that's like sharks smelling blood in the water. So I have to be detached emotionally in order to live. I have to not examine myself because that'll lead to me, being considered a threat. And I know I experienced that when I was in school. I was a sensitive kid. I cried often and was teased mercilessly because of that. So then I learned to just stuff it in, realize the only safe thing for me to suppress all of that, because to do otherwise, it would not be to be tough, to not be a man. And so then what begins to happen, because you stuff those things, but that's the only way we're supposed to relate to each other as human beings. And so we stuff it, but it still comes out in various ways, and we end up hurting those that we love. And so those are the frameworks that spill out into, oh, now I feel like I have to find my my sense of manhood through sexual conquest or through money, or I have very thin skin, so any type of critique of me I feel is disrespecting me. And so those things, and even let's just make it plain, this impacts people's attraction in interracial relationships oftentimes. Now again, you know what I mean, there's this dynamic where it's like, yo, I'm triggered by being around Black women who saw me, who I see as a mother, stern figure. So then when they experience that kind of strength, that I feel emasculated. So let me go into another space sometimes where I don't feel any of that. And I'm not saying that that's always the case or even the majority. I'm just saying that's part of the psyche of why Black women oftentimes feel like, well, why aren't people selecting? And so this thing spreads out into all different areas, and we haven't even gotten into the details yet of the specifics of how it relates to relationships or even the spiritual side of that. But was that enough context for you?
This is why I said the book needs to be written. I'm just telling, I'll keep on putting it out there because I see it in my family. Like I see it in myself. And we're talking about Black men, but I see it in myself because of being raised by, I'm in a Black family, and I see it in my father. My father, I call him is a part-time dad. I always, or a spare time, per diem dad. That's what I called him because he wasn't always around. But the thing that stands out to me as to why this is important is he said, and it seemed like he was honest, he thought that him not being around was the best for us. Like he thought we were okay without him being around. And I thought, there's so many layers of dysfunction in that sentence. Like, and you can tell what I'm talking about. So anyway, so that alone, like, shows there's so much unmet needs. There's so much unresolved issues. It's just trauma on top of trauma on top of trauma. So what are the benefits of being spiritually and emotionally healthy? And like, how do we get there? I mean, I know that it's a lifelong process, but like, what are the practical things that we can do to get there?
Yeah, no, that's good. So here's a check. So first of all, when we talk about fatherlessness, again, I want to give a credit where credit is due. In his book, Manhood Restored, Dr. Eric Mason, he says something that's really profound just to get to the root of the problem. He says that fatherlessness is the most damaging demographic trend in our society.
Yeah.
And he points out that in Philly, where Epiphany Fellowship, Philadelphia is based, and where I'm from, so I can attest to it, that there's upwards to 90% in his neighborhood fatherlessness. 90%.
It's funny because growing up, I was the majority. Like me not having my father, when someone came from a two-parent home, it was like, really?
Yeah.
I'm from Brooklyn. I grew up in Brooklyn. So.
Yep. No. So that's that's the context that creates some of this. So what he says is one of the most dynamic demographic challenges is something that is also very widespread. But here's what Schizzero lists as kind of 10 marks of emotionally unhealth, right? Unhealthy spirituality. So for those watching and listening, just kind of take note to see how many of these you've seen. Number one, using God to run from God.
Whew. In the church, yes, I've seen
Yeah.
it.
So I'm going to use spirituality to actually run from God. Number two, ignoring the emotions of anger, sadness, and fear. Ignoring. Not
Or leaving, like, oh, the past is in the past. That's what
yes.
my family says.
Yep. Yep. Three, dying to the wrong things, right? So saying, oh, I need to die to myself. And that means not actually taking care of yourself or the things that you're actually passionate about, right? Number four, denying the past's impact on the present.
Okay, so that's what I was talking about. Yeah.
Yes. That's the like, I'm good. You know, what just happened? You just lost someone close to you. No, I'm good. No, you're not. Number five, dividing our lives into secular and sacred compartments. So this is where you get the person that's like, you know, living two lives at church, right? Number six, doing for God instead of being with God. Number seven, spiritualizing away conflict. So, you know, we just, instead of dealing with conflict, just being like, I'm just going to be the better person. I'm just going to do what Jesus did. But there's still conflict under the surface. Number eight, covering over brokenness, weakness, and failure. Number nine, living without limits. And number 10, judging other people's spiritual journey. And I see this particularly in relationships with young men and young women often who, you know, the young men feel like it's their spiritual duty to be the Holy Spirit for the partner, right? Like that sense of judgment. So those are tendencies that exist in what we call unhealthy spiritual or being emotionally unhealthy in your spirituality. And one thing in particular, and this is what lands the plane for me, is what Dr. Mason, you know, refers to in his book is basically stunted growth. You ever heard of Peter Pan syndrome?
Yes.
So Peter Pan, what do you know about? Tell me about Peter Pan syndrome.
It's, you know, what, from my understanding, funny thing is that's one of the few Disney show movies that I didn't really watch, but I know that he was a grown man living or didn't want to grow up, or he
was a boy that never grew up. He stayed the same adolescent age.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And I see that, unfortunately, in my family.
Yeah.
And I was talking about it today, and not because of this, I just talked about it. A lot of people, specifically Black men who are maybe 40, but still act like they're 15.
Yeah. So Peter Pan syndrome is this idea. Peter Pan was the boy who never grew up. That's the idea behind it. And interesting, Pan was actually the name of a Greco-Roman deity. He was the god of mischief, of lust, of debauchery, right? Like that was what Pan represented. He was usually oftentimes drawn or depicted with wine in one hand, and also in very sexual, you know, with this idea of being very sexualized.
I've seen that before. I've seen that before.
So when you think about that, it's basically just going after my urges and desires in any way possible. And and one of the key components of being an adult, being healthy spiritually and emotionally, is recognizing that I can control and I ought to control my urges, and that I need to be empathetic toward how my actions impact other people. But when you have boys who don't grow up, they never get to that place. And so you kind of see it. I see it like with hip hop. Now I'm a hip hop head, so I grew up listening and watching hip hop. But it's interesting how the culture has kind of just compacted where you don't see it's not cool to be an older statesman. So all the older statesmen still try to look like their 20s and 30s. You know what I mean? And then all the 20s and 30s started even going younger and calling themselves Lil this, Lil that. You know what I mean?
Right.
As a way to, and I feel like that's part of this Peter Pan syndrome. But the other part of the problem of Peter Pan syndrome, going back to the movie, was there was Wendy syndrome. Now, Wendy was the oldest of the children of the family that went to Neverland and met with Peter Pan. And Wendy was I think Peter Pan was kind of into her, and she basically tolerated and was somewhat amused. She enjoyed the position of being the voice of reason, being the adult in the room. And
Wow.
oftentimes Peter Pan can exist without Wendy. Now you see where I'm going.
I mean, I saw where you were going, but what's coming to my mind is that I've seen the movie like maybe bits and pieces of it, but I do remember her.
Yes.
And to a certain degree, I don't know where you're going with Wendy, but to a certain degree, I think I'm the oldest girl in my family, and there's some type of Wendy there. But anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, no, that's exactly it. So oftentimes, just to show the level, so even though we're talking about Black men, there's also this dynamic where the dysfunction also pours out into the community with women as well, and being in these places where they enable this type of dysfunction, they enable this type of stunted growth, and then wonder why things change. They'll complain about it, like Wendy.
Oh, absolutely.
Peter, you don't grow up, but they'll still stay around and in the orbit of Peter, and essentially enable his stunted growth as opposed to challenging it and moving forward. So I just wanted to kind of show the full sense of that, the impacts. And part of the reason why Wendy does that is because she's also suffering from the same daddy deprivation that Peter is suffering from. You know, Peter hasn't gotten that sense of discipline and whatnot. And so neither, you know, Wendy is also wanting that sense of affirmation and that connection. And so this thing gets really challenging and interwoven in terms of the dysfunction of relationships. And you see it all the time, especially you get to see it now on like Ready to Love. Y'all don't know if you ever watched that program.
No. What is that?
Where like they get like late 30s and 40s, like Black women and men. And it's kind of like a reality show around relationships. But you see these things playing themselves out. Any type of reality show dealing with relationships. So Real Housewives of Atlanta, all this like dynamic, or I know one I watch is Married at First Sight. And, you know, that's, I watch it. So with my family, that's like family viewing, but you see these dynamics play themselves out. And oftentimes it's reflecting emotionally unhealthy spirituality. And so that's what the downside looks like. But there's hope there. We can get out of that space. We don't have to stay there. And that there are ways that I've seen how Black men in particular, how we can get out of that place. Because I'm thankful that I can recognize the signs, because I've seen there were elements of my own self that reflected that. But then I have experienced different steps of growth to get me out of it too.
And what are those steps that you took?
And with that, I'm going to end. So y'all have a good night. No. So there's several things. So I think in particular, you know, and I'll just be real honest. I think the first thing was, and Scazzaro talks about this in this book, is I had to have a healing view of God, because a healing view of God heals ourselves, because we're made in the image of God. And so if I'm not seeing God right, then I can't see myself right. And because it's a reflection, right? And I remember struggling with the idea of God as Father, because for me, that didn't have immediate appeal, because my father wasn't around even before, and then he was absent because he was murdered after that. So God as Father was not like, yes, I want this. I actually felt like, I don't know if I'm feeling this description of God. All the fathers I've seen have not been so great. And so what I began to understand as I read more, heard more, there was a great series by this pastor in Maryland, Pastor Keith Battle. He did In Search of the Father.
Oh wow! I used to watch him so much. I've got to check it out.
Yeah, and so he talked about how instead of trying to define God as Father by what you experience, actually it's the opposite. That I look at the attributes of God, and then I start to define what a father should be. And when I started to change that, shift that paradigm, I began to see, okay, God is unconditionally loving. He's compassionate. He's patient. You know what I mean? Like he's all these things. That is what a true father should look like. And so my measure of myself, you know, as a father should be measured to God, not to the people around me who are also broken and traumatized by living in the context in which they live and having the family stories that they have. And so it started for me with a right picture of God. It always starts there. And so in order for us to have our manhood restored, we also have to see the God man fully restored, because Jesus in particular is the perfect 100% picture of what it looks like for it to be emotionally healthy. When you look at what happened when one of the most amazing stories is when he's about to raise Lazarus from the dead, and he knows what he's going to do, but he still gets to the grave, and he still, shortest Bible verse in the New Testament, in the Bible, Jesus wept, that he wept. And he openly, and the text makes sure like the people are like, yo, look at how he loved this man. He's crying explicitly and publicly. And so when, I just had this funeral, and all the men, were typically trying to hold themselves together. It's like, that's not what Jesus looks like. Jesus looks like someone who's ready to grieve and who's ready to mourn. And yet at the same time, he's being proactive and not reactive. One of the things that we've inherited from our father Adam was this passivity. When people look at the garden, and they usually want to point to Eve as, why did she eat the fruit? But the thing that's crazy is it says, then she turned and gave it to the man, which meant he was sitting there right there, letting this, thing happen and not interceding. And that passivity has entered into us. And so one of the things that it looks like is being proactive. For God so loved the world that he gave his son, that whoever, believe in him shall not perish, but have eternal life. The gave is the proactivity. And so one, have a right to God, two, be proactive in mimicking what Jesus did. And that becomes really important and key. And then another one, and this is really where, the rubber hits the road, is to also be in community with other men who are going to lift me up. And so I was in this scenario, for example, when I was in college, because I came to faith at 17. So I didn't grow up in a Christian home, didn't grow up in the church. And because I was so young and I was in college, I was looked upon by 90% of the population as like, yo, you the most spiritual, righteous person we know. And I was like, yeah, y'all got it right, because none of y'all even trying to live right. So I got complacent in my own stuff. And I never forget. So there were some areas I started to kind of slip in. So, I had a female friend, was hanging out, sometimes spending the night at her place. Nothing physical was happening, but still maybe open. And I remember getting a call from one of the guys from the Cross Movement Christian rap group who I became friends with. And he was like, yo, where are you at? It's like 1 a.m. I was like, oh, I met my friend, told her the female's name. And he was like, bro, nah, you got to be out of there. That ain't cool. And I was like, and there's a part of you, man, that's like, yo, like, don't be telling me what to do. But then there was this other part that was like, you're right. And I know you're right. And I just needed to hear it from somebody else. And being put in that position really helped. And so really being in small groups with men who are also trying to live that out and live right, and to share with each other and to go deep in the emotional level and begin to talk about my emotions. What are you mad about? What are you sad about? I'm going to give a shout out to Rich Velotis. He's the pastor that actually took over Pete Scazzero's church as the lead pastor, New Life Church in Queens. And I reached out to him because he's written also about this aspect of spiritual formation and emotionally healthiness. And one of the things he talks about, he was sharing, is just the importance of building this sense of community with other people. And so that's something that I really want to encourage my fellow men to do, is to really have this sense where we not only do this, we stop with this Lone Ranger thing, and we stop with, I'm too busy to deal with my inner world. Because that is really important to try to lean into in order for us to get better.
Yes, I want to see healthy men. Like I want to see healthy people. But I had this part, like I worked for Young Life and youth ministry for over 10 years. And I would see the generational impact of, men not being there for their children, moms running the place, and the boys thinking they had to grow up quick to be the man of the home. That hurt my heart. I mean, I saw that in my own, I have 4 brothers, so I saw that in my home as well, in my family as well. They just are lost. They're so lost because they don't have that, like you said, that person, to that guy, the man that they can look up to. Because I'm somebody that they gravitated to because I'm a woman. And I noticed that. I realized that they looked at me as mom, and that's who they gravitated towards, and not the guys, because they have their moms at their home. Anyway, the point is, I have this heart for young boys, specifically Black men who, you know, they had this chance to grow up to be men who love Jesus and who are
Mm.
emotionally healthy, and they don't know how to do that. And it was very little men who actually wanted to volunteer to be in those boys' lives. For some reason, there were maybe like 2 or 3 men who I can get to volunteer out of the 6 years. Like it was
Mm.
really hard. But now that I look back, it's because of what you're talking about. Even though they're in the church, physically in the building, there's like you said, there's that trauma, there's that it's this the immaturity, the immaturity.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
yeah, and
And
so they're yeah, but go ahead.
let me tell you this too, just from a personal standpoint. I remember when I started in ministry, and you know, I at Howard University, you know, shout out
Mhm.
HU in DC, and I am tasked with like doing spiritual mentorship, what we call discipleship.
Yeah,
And I'm kind of
discipleship.
sitting there like, how am I going to do discipleship? Like, I don't even know what that looked like because I didn't feel like I had been discipled. And so
Mhm.
when and things like that, things like shaving, things like fixing a car, things
Or
that I
in the time.
never got right taught how to do growing up, and I felt a certain insecurity and
Yeah.
shame attached to the fact that I didn't know how to do those things, even though it was because I never had anybody teach me.
Yeah.
But it wasn't until I became honest about those feelings that I was able to um, kind of explore them some more. One thing that really helped me was journaling and
Oh,
writing, you know, some of this stuff out, and then being able to compare, you know, one year to the next. And what I started to learn was,
mhm.
one, again, going back to Jesus, he knew what it was like to have a blended family situation because
Yeah.
Joseph was not his biological father, but that was
Yeah.
the scenario he was in. And his identity was really framed by his heavenly father, and his
Yeah.
heavenly father's endorsement of him when he was baptized. This is
Yeah.
my son in whom I am well pleased,
Yeah. Yeah.
which took place before he ever healed somebody, before he ever said a sentence. He was already well pleased before God. And I love what Dr. Mason says in his book, Manhood Restored. It was the love and connection he had with his spiritual father that allowed him to go through anything, to allow him to experience the
Yeah.
rejection, that allowed him to experience the betrayal from his friends, and ultimately allowed him to endure the cross, despising its shame, because he knew without a shadow of a doubt where the love of God, his father, came from. And that
Yeah.
really like helped me to get over the fact that there were just things that I felt like I was so inadequate in because I didn't know what it looked like. None of the people in my family had been married. Like, we're with the person that they were married to by the time I was up. So then when it came time for me to get married, I'm 23 years old, and I'm like, okay, like,
You do.
how am I
Yeah.
supposed to do this? And we had to work through that. But fortunately, because we had open communication with each other, we were able to go through it together. And then later on in life, as I started to actually see the value of therapy and counseling,
Therapy.
it
Yes.
became really helpful for me to be able to identify these aspects of myself, to confront those areas where I had suppressed my emotions before, and learn to live with them fully. And so then I'm getting out of the manipulation of emotionally unhealthy spirituality, or trying to justify things based on God. And now I can just live and be free and invite other people into that freedom. And if they reject it, be like, okay, they're not rejecting me, they're rejecting the Father.
Not
But
personal.
before,
Yeah.
a lot of the times I'm driven by this sense of acceptance. And so that ends up causing more harm than anything else, because then when I feel like I'm being rejected, it triggers all of the type of rejection I felt from my father, that I felt from others. And so some of the men that you asked to help those young people, they're like, either like, one, what do I have to offer them? Because I
Yeah.
don't I don't have it in me. They think, but they
They
really
think
do, but they don't know that they
they do.
do. And then on the other end, it's like, just the sense of intimidation, because like you said, when those hard edges happen, where the young boys grow up without a father in the home, oftentimes they have a hard time relating to a man telling them anything, because they have all this anger pent up about what they didn't have.
Or
And
yeah.
so there's a lot of things to work through, but fortunately we're able to work through it from a spiritual standpoint, and we have hope. We're not like those that don't have hope, but it does take community. It does take real introspection and real work for us to get there, but it is possible.
Absolutely. We are over time, but why did I even think we can have this conversation in 30 minutes? It's like, come on now. We are over time, but thank you so much. Like, this is chock full, guys. I mean, there's a few things that I can think of. Journaling help is very, very helpful. Rasool talked about journaling, and he talked about, and I always hear that about with women, but men journal too, y'all. So journaling, therapy, Jesus being the epitome of emotional and spiritual health. Like, these are all great points. And you said one
and community.
Yes.
And when I say community, I don't just mean hanging out, talking about sports, watching the game. I'm talking about getting what we call getting raggedy, like sharing your going through your emotions. What are you anxious about? What are you sad about? This is what I want to challenge a man. Telling someone, what are you sad about? And what are your hopes and dreams? Talking on that level, that's what gets you to the place of vulnerability and emotionally healthy spirituality. So thanks so much. I definitely want to encourage people to get the book.
Yes, both books.
And then also both of them, these are great books that can kind of help you grow.
Yes, and somehow they're going to come together because somebody is going to write it.
Yeah. So stay tuned with me. Follow me, at Rasool Berry. So on Twitter, it's IG Rasool B. So maybe, one day the book will come out and I can hat tip Jay. Thank you for encouraging me.
All right. Thank you.
You said, do I have anything else to plug?
Yeah. And anything else that you would like to say?
Yeah. I just want to encourage y'all. There's hope. Sometimes it could be so discouraging. And you're out there and it just feels like, man, how do I grow in light of all of the trauma of the past? But the good thing is that there is good work. There are good people out there that can journey with you, and help you to do it. And there's no better place than in the arms of Christ to do it. Yeah. And so I would just encourage you with that. For those that are frustrated with seeing this in the church, let me tell you, outside the church, it ain't no better. You know what I mean? There's still the same type of trauma that exists. But then lastly, these are conversations that we have, regularly. You can check out my website, rasoolberry.com. And I have a podcast. Season 2 is coming out in a few months, as well as a series. I did a docuseries that had me go around the world. So rasoolberry.com, you can check me out. Thank you so much for having me. Hope I get to come back sometime. This was fun.
Oh, we would love for you to come back, and Tracy would be here, and this has to be like way longer. We have to figure this out. But anyway, thank you for being with us. We appreciate you.
No doubt. Take care.
All right. Have a good